I would do a pun with the name of the goddess Hel, but it's too easy. And honestly, it's dangerous making fun of death gods. I used to do it a lot, but I found that it made me go Baldr. In Norse mythology, there are many death gods. Odin is a death god. Freyr is a death god. Freya is a death goddess. And there are various others, but in this mythology, populated with deities closely associated with death, when one refers to the kenning of the goddess of death, they often mean a particular deity who lives separately from these gods. She has no place names, no known temples or idols, but her mastery over death is said to even apply to the gods themselves, making her arguably the most powerful among the gods. Her name is Hel. Howl Warder, Grave Guardian, Entombed Goddess, Matron of the Dead, Walker between worlds. Hel, Goddess of Death, is among the most controversial of the Norse gods. Many do not worship her because she is the daughter of Loki, described as a monster, even referenced as evil, and cast out of Asgard. She seems to supply Loki at Ragnarok with an army of the dead, ready to take the gods from their high place, assisting Surt, Jormungandr, and Finrur at the end of all things. Over time, she has been described as the Queen of Devils, a greedy monster, and as a competitor with Satan himself. But such is one interpretation that we have of the goddess of death. And it's from the perspective of Christians dealing with the personification of death. It's likely that this is a warped image of a very different deity, the importing of the Norse deity into Christian theology and subsequently recasting her as a demon, as was the case with many of the more feared gods of polytheist traditions. It's also possible that Hel is a later Christian fabrication, a goddess that was never worshipped in Antiquity in the first place. When we look at the concept of a Jotun, the devouring and often malicious entities opposed by the Aesir, they are often the ones who consume or destroy something. Logi, an obvious example of this, is the wildfires that consume forests and homes alike without regard for humanity. Egil, who walks the line between God and Jotun, destroys ships at sea with his jaws. But what does Hel devour? She doesn't seem to fall into this category. She isn't present at Ragnarok in any telling of it. However, Loki is said to be followed by Hel's own in Snorri's telling of Ragnarok. In the Voluspa, Loki arrives at Ragnarok on a ship laden with the people of Hel. Both tellings supply Loki with an army of the dead, and yet Hel herself is not there. However, the Larrington translation of the Poetic Edda, published by Oxford, and folklorist John Lindow reference Loki as appearing with troops of Muspel, suggesting Fire Jotun, and not an army of the dead. So, placing Hel within the mythology as a hero or a villain is difficult, considering the narratives around her. So, let's look at some of these narratives and explore them. There is first the story of the birth of Hel, as told by Snorri Sturluson. She is revealed as the daughter of Loki and Angrboda, the bringer of sorrow, about whom we have no description or information other than her name, that she's a Jotun, and her offspring. The children of Angrboda are Jormungandr, Finrur, and Hel, each of which were seen as a risk by Odin. Hel was thrown out of Asgard, but interestingly was given dominion over Helheim and the responsibility to dole out dwellings to those who arrive in her care. A description is given of her abode. Her bed is called the sick bed, her knife called famine. Her home is named after unpleasant storms. She is described as half flesh and half decay, suggesting one foot in life and the other in death. While Jormungandr and Finrur are removed from Asgard and seen as a threat, Hel seems to be a little different. She is the only one of the siblings actually granted power and authority. And this is one of the things that gives the suggestion to me that Hel is not some evil being as she's often painted. Perhaps she cannot coexist with the other deities due to her close ties with death, but this instead puts her in a unique position to fill a role unable to be filled by the other gods. As said before, there are other death gods. Freyr has dominion over the grave, Odin and Freya the battlefield, Njorthr might guide burial ships to Helheim. And these are but a few, but only Hel and Ran are considered deities specifically related to death as their primary association. And Ran may yet be a guide to Helheim with tokens of gold as reciprocity for her guidance and hospitality. Snorri writes that she watches over those who die of sickness and old age. And yet, the main story that we have featuring Hel discusses the god Baldr arriving in her care. This story both demonstrates her power and contradicts this earlier statement, as Baldr did not die of sickness or old age, and yet is under Hel's dominion. And the story tells of the gods, mainly Frigg, attempting to negotiate with Hel to release Baldr, who is especially beloved among the gods. The writer, Hermod, is sent to the underworld to broker the deal with Hel, and he sees Baldr and his wife Nanna sitting with Hel on the high seat of honor. Hermod stays through the night and in the morning asks Hel if he may take Baldr home with him. Hel responds, saying that only if all things in the world, alive or dead, weep for Baldr, can he be allowed to return. But if any object, he must remain. Hermod leaves with gifts from Baldr and Nanna for Odin and Frigg, showing an example of gifts coming from Helheim to another world. Hermod returns to the Aesir and delivers these gifts, and Frigg tries her best to fulfill the task assigned by Hel, but fails. The Aesir have a wealth of power, even the power to conquer and defeat their enemies, and yet they cannot do so with Hel, as even the gods cannot override the goddess of death. Now, there's a million questions about the story of Baldr's arrival in Helheim with his wife, but there are also questions about Baldr's status as a deity, as he is a human hero in Saxo's History of the Danes, though Saxo may have been employing euhemerism, the telling of the gods as humans, as he was often prone to do. But even there, the goddess of death reaches out in a dream and tells the fatally wounded Baldr that in 3 days she will take him in her arms, allowing him to make peace with his death, drawing parallels with Snorri's story. One of the most interesting things about Hel is that the mentions of her seem all over the place. She is referenced both as evil and as a caretaker, both as an enemy of the gods, and as a deity given a responsibility which she takes so seriously that she can deny the gods themselves. No matter how beloved by them, that which lies in her possession may be. If she were evil, we would imagine the afterlife in her control to be a haunting place. However, we have two major descriptions of Helheim, and neither of which seem to suggest this to be the case. The story surrounding the death of Thorstein Codbiter includes his acceptance into the afterlife, and it is described as a warm place of celebration where he is invited to the high seat by his father, just as Baldr sits in the high seat with Hel. Thorstein is accompanied by his crew, all of which were lost at sea along with him. The second major description is that of King Hadding being led into the afterlife by a mysterious woman. She shows him a number of things on the way to Helheim, but the journey ends at the gates. The woman then throws a beheaded rooster over the wall, and we hear its crow on the other side, showing that this is a place of life, even in death. And this woman is not given a name. She is only described as standing next to a fire with herbs out of season. Perhaps this guide was Hel herself. This would be in line with the idea that perhaps there was worship of Hel in antiquity. The evidence of this is scant, and it is possible that Hel is simply a later personification of death. But we do have a couple of migration era pendants. I'm going to say pendants because I don't know how to pronounce this word. But these pendants may possibly depict Hel meeting a rider. The scene described by Snorri as Hermod brokers for Baldr's life. This story could be incredibly old, or this scene could be depicting an entirely different story, lost to time. Whatever the reality of her ancient worship, Christians would consistently recast her as evil or even as a demon in later mentions. Hel is mentioned in the saga of Saint Bartholomew. A demon living within an idol mentions Hel as his queen, though she is not mentioned beyond this. The demon basically just goes, "Yas, queen," and then moves on. But another, more detailed account discusses Hel as another entity coexisting with Satan in the Christian Hel, though she is one that does not take kindly to Satan, demanding through poetry that he leave her dwelling, establishing her own sovereignty within the Christian Hel. Best part about that? Satan leaves her alone. Even Satan is like, "I'm not fucking with this one. I'll fuck with the Almighty," but not. This seems to be a Christian recasting of a death god into an evil character. One of the things that's interesting about the Christian writing of the sagas is that they will recast religious pagans into atheists as soon as they're heroes, and perhaps there was a similar dynamic with the gods. The passages that I mentioned before support the idea of a maternal goddess of death that fits the role of a caretaker. And it's not hard to imagine that Christians replace the caretaker of the afterlife with a demon. You can't have another afterlife rolling around with conversions to make. Gotta hit those conversion quotas. Let's turn that competitor afterlife figure into a demoness, and then no one will worship her, except later we'll think that's really freaking cool. But this image of Hel as evil doesn't really quite fit with the rest of Norse mythology. If she's so haunting, then why do so many gods seem to guide souls to her? Why are mountains and graves associated with the afterlife considered so reverent and sacred and not places of fear? It seems to me that these narratives of Hel as a demon supplanted a more healthy view of death's place as part of our world, among all other things. But if this leads us to believe in a more caring and maternal energy about Hel, then why are there no place names, no idols even described, only a possible suggestion of her worship here and there? And the answer to this might be hinted at in the saga of Grettir the Strong, who, in describing a close brush with death, says of Hel that she laid claim to his life, but that his friend kept Loki's deathly daughter at bay, saving his life. Egil Skallagrimsson says similarly of Hel when he mourns the loss of his sons. He remarks that Hel awaits him as well, but he stands resolute, waiting for his own death, suggesting it is not here just yet. And afterward he holds the funeral for his sons. Now these examples suggest that it's possible that though Hel was seen as a caring hostess of the afterlife and a respected deity, that she was one best kept at a distance. Both Egil and Grettir note Hel's controversial parentage and siblings. Death is, after all, not something one typically desires, so it only makes sense that place names and temples might be exceptions if they ever existed. One can imagine that to engage in reciprocity with death might be to invite death into your life. So it would be reasonable to view Hel with respect, but have no desire to have a close relationship with her. There are those, however, that view Hel a little differently, including myself. To worship a death god in the sense of Ran or Hel would be to acknowledge the service they perform for the dead. Ran is the guide for the dead at sea. Hel is the caretaker of our ancestors. And this is a position granted to her by Odin, the allfather of the Aesir. Reciprocity would be offerings in thanks for their service. Part of where I stand on this is inspired, or at least strengthened, by Egil's comment on Hel as waiting for him on the Ness, meaning the shore, the boundary between land and water. And she isn't chasing him, she's waiting, calmly, as death is patient. She is a guide between that border for the dead whenever they go to meet her. And her appearance of half flesh and half decay, described in Snorri's Edda, might symbolize that she is able to walk easily between the land of the dead and the land of the living, as she is both. Some heathens have views of the afterlife coupled with a desire to go to Valhalla, Folkvangr, or one of the many afterlives described throughout Norse mythology. For me, however, I have an expectation that, should the afterlife exist, I'll wind up in Helheim. At least that's the most likely. And if that's the case, that's one more reason that reciprocity with Hel would make sense. Around Halloween, I hold a bloat, that is a heathen ritual to Hel, and sometimes it's with a group, sometimes it's not, and this is an entirely modern practice within my own approach to the faith, but the practice is one that acknowledges aspects of both of the arguments presented here, that fostering reciprocity with Hel is easily justified, but it's also easily justified that perhaps Hel is a goddess best kept at a distance. The solution is that ritual is performed with a mask, such as this one, as a ritual symbol of that desire for distance, while also expressing respect, which ties in well with modern traditions around Halloween. The offering is messages for those in her care, written on paper and burned in sacrifice, potentially along with other offerings. Now, that's for my practice, and it may not fit within yours. Maybe it does. Either is fine. The lack of information around some of these deities of the past can offer opportunities for innovation on practice, and I think that any practice around Hel is going to be one of those situations. In order to conduct a Helblot, one must innovate because we have no information on what that ritual would have looked like, when it might have been, or even if it would have existed. But having done it a few times now, I've always found it enriching to my spirituality. But let me know your thoughts. Do you think that there were rituals to Hel in history? Is she a part of your practice in any way? Let me know why or why not. Modern traditions around Hel are just wide and varied, and if you have any, let me know what they are. Sharing information about how we approach this religion can help foster our spiritual development together. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. The like and subscribe button have turned into Droger and are slowly eating my subscribers one by one. Clicking them can stop them, or don't, and the massacre will be the weight upon your soul. Ringing the bell will stop the Droger forever, so I advise that one. I can't do it. YouTube doesn't let me ring my own bell. That sounds weird. Anyway, it falls upon you. And remember to find a way or make one.